And hi, I'm Paul Gibbons, and this is a look at 7 broad paradigms or structural means of adopting AI based on my research on what is happening in AI, specifically agentic AI. All in Intelligence is a monthly C-suite briefing on AI designed for my C-suite and board clients. As a broad frame, AI adoption reveals how much risk are we willing to take and what is our expected return on that risk. That way, AI strategy is a risk management exercise. If you aren't ambitious, you can afford to be very cautious in your approach to AI. If you are ambitious, you need to think like a disruptor. Honestly, the best CEOs I know never, ever worry about being disrupted. They let their competitors worry about being disrupted. And there are risks both ways, going too fast and breaking something that can't be unbroken, say customer trust, or going too slowly and probably being out of business in a decade. Because even if a direct competitor doesn't out AI you, Procter & Gamble versus Unilever, the threat of disrupting entire vertical startups, microservices is enormous. And that's beginning to happen. Well, for the 7 archetypes, I want to look at 3 modes of AI adoption. There are essentially 3 things you can do. One is to drill down on personal productivity. When your people use ChatGPT to speed up office work, writing emails, working with spreadsheets, that's great. That's fine. It's irrelevant at scale. There are no system level results. Why do I say that? Consider if research and development in your firm all of a sudden produced 10x the output. It would lie on the cutting room floor because you need the rest of the business to do something with it. Inventions have to work their way through every single function to launch and scale. The second is the most defensive, embedded SaaS AI. You buy Copilot, you buy Salesforce Einstein, the board feels good, the stock looks good. This is the safe option, which is exactly why it's not a competitive advantage, because if everybody is doing it, and many people are, well, where's your differentiation? It's safe also in the fact that it's very secure from a cybersecurity point of view. But in my view, you trade a lot of value in exchange for that possibility. And the final of the third, the most ambitious, is agentic orchestration. You build AI into the DNA of the company, into the operating model, into the workflows. The company starts to think differently. It does things that were unimaginable previously, and that's where the value is. And that's where 95% of companies aren't. The first 2 are relatively easy. The third is incredibly hard. The first 2 generate extremely modest returns. The third, possibly multiplicative returns. What's the foundation underneath all 3? Behavioral governance, new kinds of leadership, and innovation design, what I call change agility. The above is a product of the last 18 months of my life, not the names, the toolkits, the processes, the behaviors, the ways I enable human teams to get adoption done. And without those enabling processes in the yellow, the modes are just risky, expensive decoration. Those, by the way, are my proprietary model of AI adoption. This is not a pitch deck. So these are these 7 archetypes, starting with the Maginot Line and going all the way towards Terra Nova. On the left is defensive and static. In the middle is the fulcrum, the pivot point, and on the right is generative and expansive, companies that are betting on intelligence as a core competency. Most of your competitors are in the stations on the left, stations 1 through 3. They call that a strategy. I'm not so sure it is. Let's walk through what each one looks like and the failure modes. So the French built the Maginot Line to stop the Germans. Magnificent engineering, an incredible investment, was pointing the wrong way. The Germans went around it in 6 weeks. Now, let me tell you 2 quick stories and see if whether you think the Maginot Line is a hyperbolic description of what's going on in AI. I was presenting to the CTO's team on organizational change, and I was casually asked them, what are you using AI for in this business? And their answer, legal has told us to absolutely avoid it. Keep the damn thing out of the building. And this was one of the largest food and beverage companies in North America, and it was in early 2025. That's an extraordinary thing. Legal was effectively dictating the strategy, perhaps for the next decade. And if they were wrong, well, the company would be in great big trouble. And if they are right, it may burn down more slowly. The second story, I was giving a keynote on AI to 100 chemicals industries executive. I used to be a chemist for my sins. I get to the workshops part of the talk, and each table of 8 was given a business problem to solve, a real chunky business problem to solve. New market, new product, new strategy. And they were given AI tools, the sort of stuff that would take a consulting firm perhaps, I don't know, a month to do. They charge $500,000. The goal, use AI and prototype something in 30 minutes. And when I said, get out your phones and pull out your AI tools and get to work on this, open your favorite LLM, there was a CTO at the back who went apoplectic and red. He was furious that I would suggest that people use personal LLMs to solve business problems. He didn't want people in his business doing that. And here is the story. We got on with the exercise. The room was electric for 30 minutes. And this wasn't just personal AI, the first in adoption modes. You see, humans love solving problems and building things. And AI makes us way faster and better at that. The Maginot Company is building AI defenses for a world that no longer exists. Regularly compliance theater, ethics committees that produce PDFs, governance frameworks that govern nothing. And meanwhile, the man on the right invented the digital camera while working for Kodak in 1975. And Kodak buried it because it threatened the existing film business. And the Kodak story features prominently in one of my books, but these were the most fascinating tales. They had almost a 50% market share. They had unlimited resources, access to capital, access to talent, access to markets, access to customers, all the capital engineering expertise in the world, incredible R&D department, and they were bust before too long. On a personal note, my teenage investment years when I was starting out, I went long Kodak because of this. It didn't work out so well. The Maginot Line. And let's move on to what the next level of ambition, the not quite defense only, but something only is a little bit more ambitious. Cargo cult AI. And the strapline here is you can't rent innovation. Coca-Cola commits $1.1 billion to Microsoft Azure. P&G rolls out Copilot, press releases, standing ovations, everybody happy. Here's the truth. If everybody has the same license, the license is an advantage. The vendor builds the capability, you rent access to it, and you fund their R&D. Let that truth sink in. You are renting AI capability. You are not building it natively. They get the long-term benefit. You get a tiny few percentage points, tenths of a percentage points on ROI. They get the learning. You get the invoice. So the cargo cult story, the cargo cult had runways. They had the right tools. They performed the right rituals. They just had no planes. And SaaS AI, in a way, it's a logical enough starting point, but it's far, far from a destination. And what we're finding increasingly in the AI world is native SaaS companies, the ones that it's in my entire consulting career, 35 years building, they may be more of a barrier than a benefit to AI adoption. And what I call this is the SaaS cul-de-sac. It looks like a safe option. It's a competitive death trap. The car in a cul-de-sac going nowhere, Oracle on the left, Salesforce on the right, beautiful houses, lovely neighborhood, no way of getting out. Your board just approved the Salesforce Einstein upgrade. Your CIO greenlit Oracle's AI layer. Everybody nodded and nobody has a hard question. What happens when your competitors is exactly the same thing? So it's not a moat. You're renting a little bit of extra capability with minimal risk. And here are the problems. There's the sunk cost trap. Perhaps you've spent millions, hundreds of millions on the legacy stack. Nobody wants to look dumb. And then there's the integration illusion. Your Salesforce brain can't talk to your Oracle brain. You're trying to build agentic AI, but they need access to SAP data, and SAP doesn't want you to have that. Oh, no, 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 no. So least intelligence is not enterprise intelligence. It's expensive silos with better PR. And if you try and build agentic AI that requires SaaS data, good luck. The Logic Light Enterprise, every prompt you run through their system makes them smarter. Let's hear that again. If you're using native, home-built, on-prem, agentic AI, your models are getting smarter. This way, their models are getting smarter. So the escape route looks harder, owning the reasoning, owning the data, building capability that compounds inside your walls and not theirs. I think that's a more sensible game. Let's get more ambitious. The panopticon. But you can't coerce curiosity. Two companies, same problem, two different approaches. Accenture, they made the headlines and were slammed for tracking AI logins and tying promotions to AI usage frequency. The result, 27% of employees comfortable delegating to AI. Voluntary experimentation down 15 points in 6 months. As we say, no bueno. Now, the other metric, of course, is a login, a good way of measuring adoption. My kids log on to AI. Does that count as a useful, productive use of the technology? Certainly not. In contrast, McKinsey AI black belts embedded in their teams. Lilly, their internal AI, underline the word internal, 94% adoption, 74% regular use, 19 million prompts. And now they screen for AI curiosity at final round hiring. And by the way, everybody's going to do that. Good luck getting a job in 2027 if you aren't fluent in AI. That's a side note. And here's some psychology of why surveillance and coercion never, ever work. In 1973, psychologists Lepper, Green, and Nisbet gave children who loved drawing magic markers and paid them to draw. Yeah, probably candy in those days today would be Labubus. And so they gave them this external reward, and the kids drew more. That's not the end of the story. Because when they withdrew the reward, now the kids did it much, much less than they did in status quo ante. Think about that. Think about what happened. They were used to associating the task, play, with the reward. You take the reward away, and the internal motivation, the fun, the joy, the play of working with markers. Well, you kill that. And that's a very salutary tale. Intrinsic motivation is fragile. But intrinsic motivation is what you need to unlock AI capabilities, passion, curiosity, tinkering, constant learning. If you try coercing the behavior, you lose the motivation. Surveillance is not AI adoption. And here we get to the middle, and this is where we pivot to some models that are really very interesting. The dojo, deliberate practice, mastery, real learning, not completion certificates, prompt lounge, pair prompting, workflow teardowns, failure journals, document where AI broke because that's where you learn. Reverse mentoring, the 24-year-old mentoring the CHRO, sprint challenges, simulation sandbox, cohort-based progression from white belt to black belt. These are 21st century learning modalities. Sadly, my friends in learning development are not really keeping up. That is a very, very current year challenge, is how can they move from webinars and mandatory compliance training, the odd bits to stand-up training? How can they move to these enabling these more dynamic modes of learning? So the dojo is not just training, it's changing the cognitive infrastructure of the human layer. AI brings cognitive infrastructure to the firm, but you need the cognitive human layer, in a sense, to keep up, to be able to work with these intelligence in a dynamic and productive way. The skunk works. And here we decide we're not going to risk the business, but what we're going to do is give people a little room and some resources and some capital and some technology and start to create. We use design thinking. At IBM, we had something called IBM Garage that I helped develop at PwC in the 1990s. Every big consulting firm has something like that. You put people in a room for a week, tell them to put their mobile phones away and get to work really creatively designing the future of the business. However, unfortunately, lots of transformation dies there. What we discovered at IBM was that we could do some really interesting things in the garage. And boy, did people leave pumped up. Just a week just to innovate, learn, and think creatively and design the future of a business, overjoyed. But when that hits the native organization, I call it host versus graft rejection. It comes from medicine, obviously. The immune system of the organization attacks what's just been built, what it didn't grow itself. The politics, the legacy processes, the middle managers who weren't consulted, they don't kill it loudly. They just kill it slowly, doing what they always do. Skunkworks is the protected unit, and it's a magnificent way to innovate. It's a terrible way to scale. And the question isn't then in a skunkworks whether the pilot works. The question is whether you have the organizational architecture to let it survive contact with the mothership. Let's get even. And finally, let's talk about the colony, more ambitious still. Every organization on the previous slides is trying to change while staying the same. That's the sad fact of the matter. The colony makes a different bet. The only way to build something genuinely new is to physically separate it from where you already are. So JP Morgan, for example, 4 trillion in assets, the most sophisticated financial data on earth, relationships with every significant institution globally. God knows how many customers. They have 300,000 people working there who know exactly what a bank's supposed to do. Very clever people. The colony says, well, let's take some of those assets. Let's take the data. Let's take the capital. Let's take the expertise and leave the legacy bankers, infrastructure, tech stack, some of that behind, or at least leave their assumptions behind. So this isn't really a lab and it's not really a pilot. It's a civilization within a civilization with its own rules, its own commercial logic, its own strategy, its own hiring profile, really important for AI, its own definition of success. So it reports to the mothership financially, but not culturally. So the risk here isn't failure. Colonies are well-resourced. They rarely fail from lack of capital. The risk is repatriation. The mothership starts to demand returns too early or withdraws resources too early. So those are the critical failure points there. They want to fold the new colony that's doing so well into its existing structure, its existing compliance frameworks, its existing politics. And that's how colonies die. Not on Mars, but on the shuttle home. And the question for your organization isn't whether you can afford to build a colony, it's whether you can afford to leave it alone for long enough to matter. And finally, we get to, by far, the most ambitious way to think about AI adoption, and a way, I'll be frank with you, nobody's doing it. We need to leave behind what we are. As they sometimes say, to get to the furthest shore, you have to have the courage to leave sight of the shore you're leaving. We in businesses optimize, protect, spin it out, run it faster, but the existing business is full of anchors, legacy tech stack, legacy branding, legacy product, existing markets, leader mindsets. And sometimes someone ventures, what if we did this? Within those legacy cultures, there's a loud chorus of buts and organizational frictions. The trader, for example, is a brilliant idea for a new type of fund, discovers IT wants 9 months to build it and Legal needs a year to approve it, right? So what, they go do it on their own. That's almost apocryphal, by the way. Medieval cartographers wrote, "Here be dragons at the edge of the known world," not because anybody had ever seen a dragon, but because they didn't imagine what was out there. They couldn't imagine what was beyond what they could see. With capital relationships to some of the most experienced people we can find, what could we become if we forget who we are? And these are the interesting questions of today. Is what if we put some of our finest minds in the room with access to some of the resources that contribute value, not some of the resources that defend the enterprise and withdraw value? And what if we started to think about, well, let's take Procter & Gamble. It has household trust at a planetary scale, last mile distribution to every home on the planet, and decades of behavioral data on domestic life, has access to capital. And what if we took some really clever people from that firm in a room and said, not like, how do we make better soap? how do we make better detergent? The question is whether the people in the room can forget they make detergent long enough to ask what else the infrastructure could become. And this isn't very blank slate, and this is why nobody else did it. I mean, consider if you would go back to the age of Da Vinci, you asked Da Vinci to partnership with this machine. This is the co-creative exercise. This is putting the intelligence in the room. And this is saying, what could we create together? Like if you were Da Vinci, it's like, okay, I get that you're really smart. Like, what magic can we make happen? And imagine what would have happened to one of the cleverest minds and greatest inventors of all time if he had something like that along him. Well, I think that's a really interesting story. I'm guilting here. No big company that I know of is doing this. It isn't science fiction, it's business fiction. Now, there are legions of examples at micro scale. The gifted product manager, sick of fighting the system, makes the jump. Has their AI run operations, finance, and technology. She's a single mom who has $3 million in ARR within 9 months. By the way, that's a true story. She's doing what she loves and what she excels at and designing products and talking to customers because that's what she does. She likes the people side of it. She likes the design side. She leaves the rest of the bots. Inside her organization, she was strangled. In my advisory business, I have a bot, a CMO, a CFO, a CTO, and a chief of staff. I don't know what it would cost to have those in a business like that. That's probably, I don't know, $1 million in annual salary, $340 a month. That's nuts. It's early days for these kind of experimentations, but this is the wild, undiscovered country. On a bigger scale, Jeff Bezos, he was selling books, and he built some infrastructure to help him do that better. That infrastructure is called Amazon Web Services. The infrastructure under the bookstore became much more valuable than the bookstore. And that's sort of Terra Nova kind of thinking. Musk, circa 2002, the cleanest example, PayPal exit. Who thinks like this? I'll start a rocket company and let me compete with Boeing and Lockheed. An electric car company that competes with Ford and Toyota. This is almost psychotic category-free thinking. And there's one thing to say about Musk. He doesn't allow his thinking to be constrained by rules. He could have taken, I can't think it was $833 million from PayPal and lived very comfortably for the rest of his life. And credit to his ambition, and he's a very controversial character. It's a credit to his ambition and inventiveness and intelligence. As he said, what could we do that nobody has ever done before? I mean, consider the craziness of starting SpaceX. There's only one customer. It's not quite true. Essentially, the biggest customer is NASA. NASA has locked in 10, 20-year contracts to get things done. Well, I'm going to start a rocket company, and I'm going to outcompete Boeing and Lockheed. How much capital do you have? Oh, I don't know, about 1% of what they have. And yet he managed it, and he's a category killer in that. So I think this is a really interesting way of thinking about what could we become if we let go of who we are. If Da Vinci, again, to go back to him, had an LLM, he wouldn't have said, help me paint faster. He would have co-created something amazing. And what I've wondered for 35 years in business is how much value do you expect to get copying someone else's best practice? Seriously. Like business runs on being safe. You know why? Because if everybody's doing it, and it ends up being a bad idea, you're defended when shareholders come to scrutinize. The safe strategy. And then you won't know whether safe was absurd for another 5 years when instead of crashing and burning, you melted down slowly. Every legacy product, system, role, function, and workflow tech stack in the company has its defenders. Many of them will die on that hill. But here's the thing. Same is safe. At IBM, we used to joke, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. And that's why. Not because it was the best, but because if this goes badly, well, IBM passes the smell test at board level. So as you listened to those 6 more conservative strategies, bear this one in mind. It's an escape hatch. But it's the only archetype when AI makes possible what you couldn't previously conceive. And as Bob Dylan said, hard rain's going to fall. 88% of global enterprises have AI in at least one function. That can mean a lot of things, by the way. That can mean a Copilot license. 72% of CEOs are now personally driving AI strategy. It's about bloody time. 31% are seeing financial impact. And by the way, it's my hypothesis, and this is hard because no one will admit to this until after the fact, that quite a lot of people are hemorrhaging money on this. Why? Because they're doing it wrong. The technology is 300-fold more efficient than it was 3 years ago. 300x. Cleverer, faster, better, more efficient. Those are real numbers, by the way. So I don't totally buy the numbers that I've just given you, that based on surveys. Deloitte goes into a company, audits the functions, and evaluates the CEO leadership. These are self-reports. This is what companies say they're doing, and I always take those with a grain of salt. What do you expect a business to say today? No, we haven't got AI in any functions, and CEO doesn't really care about it right now. He's got other interests. Couldn't say that. Couldn't say that on an investor conference call. Add the value gap is also sus again. How do businesses respond when people asked if they're getting value from investment? I mean, maybe they're honest, but probably not. You think anybody's really saying, nope, not us. Losing money, it's probably a waste of money. ROI 3-5 years out. Nobody says that, right? They got shareholders, investor conference calls. But the numbers do tell you one thing, that the intention is there. The execution isn't. And this is what's not in the data. The gap between the leaders who are doing this well and the laggards is widening every quarter. The company's getting 2x productivity gains in some functions. They're not slowing down to let you catch up. Moreover, they might be accelerating, because by the time you begin to build the capability, everything else that you try to do is faster, because you've overcome, if you will, the jam jar. And I'll say, once the jam jar that's stuck begins to move, what they call in physics a stiction, you could unleash quite a lot of progress. So I think, this is the time. 26 is going to be a year of reckoning. Not everybody's going to come out well. That's for certain. And then finally, on AI adoption, I want to talk about alignment. Because one of the things, as you heard, is a red thread that goes through all of this, is that it's incredibly complex. There's vertical AI, horizontal AI, there's leadership mindsets, there's compliance governance, there's legal, there's human process, there's skill building, there's strategy, there's the turmoil in the external environment. You need a model, a governance framework that helps you think through the multi-dimensionality and the complexity of the system. And I don't think that nearly enough people are doing that well.